I believe my husband. I believe my husband. This was all organized from the opposition.
Live television has its surprises, but this was different. What began as an ordinary interview slowly turned into something no one in the room seemed prepared for. The tone shifted, the host leaned in, and the guest's voice began to tremble. In just moments, years of carefully guarded composure slipped away, and the silence between her sentences spoke louder than anything she could say. Viewers felt it instantly. Something deeply personal had just been exposed, and the reaction from a familiar figure was impossible to ignore. The live TV shock that froze Melania. It was supposed to be just another segment in a busy day of morning television, a warm, easygoing interview about wellness, positivity, and personal growth. Marla Maples, the former actress and one-time wife of Donald Trump, was there to promote her latest project. The set was bright, the host all smiles, and the audience relaxed. But somewhere between the light banter and the promotional talking points, the mood shifted. Viewers saw it happen. Marla's expression changed, her voice caught, and in a moment that seemed to happen in slow motion, the confident tone gave way to something raw and trembling. She paused, tried to regain her composure, but then the words came out. They weren't part of the segment's outline, and certainly not what the producers had planned. Marla began speaking about her daughter Tiffany's childhood, weaving in details that painted a very different picture from the glossy family image the public had been shown over the years. It wasn't just what she said, it was the weight in her voice, the unspoken grief that seemed to hang in the air. And while millions watched from home, a different kind of reaction was playing out somewhere else, one not captured by the broadcast cameras. Sources close to the production later claimed that Melania Trump, who had reportedly been made aware of the interview, had been following along. The moment Marla mentioned Tiffany's childhood without her father around, observers noted a subtle but undeniable change in Melania's expression. The calm, reserved look she's known for allegedly hardened, not into anger, but into something colder. Perhaps it was discomfort, perhaps recognition, or perhaps something else entirely. For years, Melania has cultivated an image of controlled elegance, rarely letting the public see her react emotionally to anything, especially family matters. That's why the timing of Marla's revelations couldn't have been more striking. This wasn't just an old wound being discussed on national television. It came at a point when Melania's own public image was under quiet scrutiny. Rumors, never confirmed but widely whispered, suggested tension between her and her husband's public life, especially after recent headlines involving other women from Trump's past. Marla's sudden vulnerability didn't name Melania, didn't accuse, didn't even criticize directly. But to those watching, the subtext felt impossible to ignore. Here was another woman who had stood in the exact same position Melania holds now, hinting at the cost of that role, not in dollars, but in years of emotional strain. The fact that it happened live, without warning, made it all the more jarring. Some fans speculated it was pure coincidence. Others thought it was a carefully timed move, not to attack, but to send a quiet, coded message. If it was intentional, it was done masterfully. If it wasn't, it might have been even more powerful. Because unscripted truth, or what feels like it, has a way of cutting through every polished facade. The reaction online was instant. Clips of the segment spread across social media, with viewers dissecting every word, every pause, every flicker of emotion. What struck people most was not just what Marla revealed, but how it seemed to ripple outward, reaching even those who weren't in the studio that day. And for Melania, who has spent years avoiding the appearance of personal vulnerability in public, that ripple could not have come at a more inconvenient moment. What the cameras didn't catch that day reveals an even more personal blow, and it came from years of buried history. A history written in silence. When Marla Maples first entered the public eye, it wasn't as the celebrated partner of a powerful man. It was as the so-called other woman in one of the most talked-about affairs of the early 90s. The headlines were merciless. She was splashed across tabloids not for her work, but for her role in the very public unraveling of Donald Trump's marriage to Ivana. To the media machine, she was the villain of a soap opera played out on the streets of Manhattan. Every move was photographed, every outfit analyzed, every smile interpreted as a statement. But the woman who dominated the gossip columns in those years eventually disappeared from them altogether. After her marriage to Trump ended in 1999, Marla seemed to retreat from the spotlight entirely. There were occasional public appearances, but no tell-all interviews, no explosive memoirs, no TV specials to set the record straight. She chose quiet, whether by preference or necessity, is something only she knows. In time, her name faded from the gossip cycle, and she became the forgotten ex-wife, the one the public barely remembered unless Tiffany's name came up. For Tiffany Trump, life was a strange combination of privilege and absence. On paper, she had everything: an upbringing surrounded by wealth, access to elite schools, and the Trump name. But as Marla has since hinted, what was missing mattered just as much as what was there. There were birthdays without her father's presence, holidays marked more by scheduled visits than spontaneous family time. The public saw photos of Tiffany smiling at galas or charity events, but they didn't see the phone calls that went unanswered or the notes that ended with, "I wish you were here." Those moments, the quiet ones that never make the news, leave their own kind of imprint. And according to people familiar with the Trump family's inner workings, there was an unspoken agreement among its members. Certain things were simply never to be discussed publicly. Relationships, private disputes, and emotional matters were kept locked behind closed doors. In return for loyalty, there was security, financial and otherwise. But loyalty meant silence, even when the truth was heavy to carry. For years, Marla upheld her end of that pact. She smiled in photographs, avoided direct criticism, and refrained from offering personal accounts that might embarrass anyone involved. Whether it was to protect her daughter, to avoid retaliation, or simply to keep her own peace, she stayed quiet. Many in her position might have done the same, especially given the family's reach and the intense scrutiny that comes with crossing it. But silence has a weight of its own, and eventually, it begins to show. Those who knew her privately say Marla had stories, not necessarily to hurt, but to be heard. And after decades of holding them back, cracks were bound to form. That's why, when an old piece of footage unexpectedly resurfaced during a recent interview, the reaction from Marla wasn't just surprise, it was something much deeper. The clip had been buried for years, forgotten by most, but when the host played it, her entire posture changed. She looked as if she'd just seen a ghost, a reminder of the exact moment her life shifted forever. That silence shattered when old footage resurfaced, and Marla's reaction told more than her words ever could. The clip that reopened old wounds. The moment came without warning. 1 minute, the interview was moving through the expected beats, light conversation, promotional talking points, the occasional personal anecdote. Then the host introduced a surprise from the archives, grainy footage from 1990, back when Marla Maples was still a rising actress and Donald Trump was in the midst of his highly publicized split from Ivana. In the clip, a younger Marla sat in a television studio, denying in no uncertain terms that she was romantically involved with Trump. Her eyes were wide, her voice calm, but to anyone watching now, it carried a different weight. At the time, her words were taken at face value, at least in public. But decades later, with everything the world has learned about the Trump marriage saga, the footage felt almost haunting. Viewers couldn't help but wonder, was she protecting herself, protecting him, or simply trying to survive the relentless tabloid frenzy of the moment? Whatever the answer, the reaction in the present was telling. As the clip played, Marla's face seemed to drain of color. She leaned back slightly, almost as if instinctively distancing herself from the image on the screen. Her hands tightened in her lap, and then she murmured something barely audible. That girl had no idea what was coming. It was a sentence that didn't require context. Everyone watching could feel the sting in it, a recognition of innocence lost, of the life that followed those denials. But Marla wasn't the only one absorbing that moment. According to a source connected to the production, Melania Trump was made aware that the interview would include archival footage. It's unclear whether she watched the broadcast in real time or was briefed shortly afterward, but those close to her claimed the effect was immediate. Melania has rarely, if ever, commented on Donald's previous marriages. Yet people who have worked with her describe her as acutely aware of how those histories play into the public's perception of her own role. Seeing Marla confronted with her younger self's words and visibly shaken may have struck a chord deeper than anyone anticipated. And that's where the domino effect began. The resurfacing of that clip didn't just stir old emotions for Marla, it rippled through the layers of history and image that surround the Trump family. Suddenly, the public was revisiting the early 90s scandal, the transition from Ivana to Marla, and from Marla to Melania. It brought up comparisons, not all of them flattering, about what it means to stand beside a man whose personal life has been a fixture in the press for decades. In a way, the clip acted like a key unlocking a sealed door. It didn't reveal every detail, but it reminded everyone that behind the polished photographs and carefully curated appearances, there are stories that haven't been told in full. And once a door like that is cracked open, people want to see more. And then came the line that many believe was aimed straight at Donald, without ever saying his name. A truth wrapped in a metaphor. Marla didn't raise her voice, she didn't point fingers or name names. Instead, she leaned into the kind of carefully crafted sentence that lands harder because it feels almost like poetry. She described a man who needs the roar of a crowd more than the quiet of love. It was a simple line, but it carried weight. There was no need to identify who she meant. Anyone who had followed her story and the man at the center of it could connect the dots. The brilliance of that phrasing was its restraint. She didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. She didn't outline a list of grievances. She merely painted an image, one of someone whose need for applause, admiration, and public validation outweighs the intimacy of private affection. For some, it was a universal truth about certain personalities. For others, it was a direct reflection of Donald Trump. What made the moment more intriguing was how it seemed to echo Melania's own public experiences. As First Lady, she had often been photographed alone at events or walking a few paces behind her husband. The media frequently speculated about their interactions, or lack thereof, in public. There were moments, caught on camera, where her expression appeared distant while Trump basked in the energy of a crowd. Whether those moments truly reflected her private reality, only she could say. But hearing Marla's metaphor, some viewers couldn't help but draw parallels. It wasn't just the crowd imagery that resonated. The contrast between public performance and private connection is something anyone in the spotlight understands. But in the Trump orbit, it takes on a sharper edge. For Melania, whose role demanded constant public appearances and whose marriage has been under a microscope, the metaphor could have felt uncomfortably close to home. Did she see herself in Marla's words? That's something the audience can only wonder. And then there was the speculation about the true target of Marla's message. Some thought it was meant for the public, a way to share a personal truth without inviting direct conflict. Others believed it was aimed squarely at Melania, a subtle nod from one woman to another who had walked the same path. If that's the case, it was the kind of coded communication that bypasses headlines and speaks directly to shared experience. The online reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters of Marla saw it as a moment of bravery, a way of reclaiming her narrative without crossing the line into open attack. Critics saw it as a veiled jab designed to stir headlines. Either way, it was impossible to ignore. The line was replayed in social media clips, quoted in online forums, and dissected in opinion pieces. And for Melania, if she heard those words, the question wasn't whether they were aimed at her, but whether they were meant as a warning, a gesture of solidarity, or both. Because in the world of public image and private alliances, sometimes the loudest messages are the ones spoken softly. But the story didn't end there, because the moment the cameras went off, another player stepped into the game. The aftermath and the unspoken alliance. The interview ended, but the echoes of Marla's words spread quickly. Within hours, reaction poured in, not just from viewers online, but from the Trump orbit itself. Donald Trump did not publicly address Marla's comments, something that in itself drew attention. Known for responding swiftly and often bluntly to criticism, his silence was unusual. But other members of the family stepped forward. Eric Trump dismissed the interview as another attempt at playing the victim, while Donald Trump Jr. called Marla irrelevant and a has-been. What struck many was not the insults, those were expected, but what they left out. Neither of them directly challenged the accuracy of Marla's stories. There were no denials about missed birthdays, no rebuttals about Tiffany's childhood, no counterclaims to the emotional picture she painted. Instead, their responses focused on undermining her credibility. It was as if the details themselves were untouchable territory. That choice didn't go unnoticed. Commentators across the political spectrum pointed out that avoiding direct refutation often leaves space for the audience to believe the claims might be true. And surprisingly, even some conservative-leaning outlets began to acknowledge the significance of what Marla had said. While they didn't necessarily endorse her version of events, they admitted her statements carried the kind of personal insight only someone who had lived within that inner circle could provide. This shift was rare. The Trump brand has long been able to control the narrative through loyal media allies. But Marla's history with the family, combined with her years of silence, gave her words a different weight. She wasn't an outside critic with a political agenda. She was a former spouse speaking from experience. And for some viewers, that distinction mattered. Then there was Melania. As the story gained traction, reporters looked to her for any kind of reaction. But no comment came, no official statement, no spokesperson, no quiet correction slipped into an interview. The First Lady turned private citizen simply stayed silent. It was a silence that fans and critics alike rushed to interpret. For some, it was a sign of loyalty to her husband, a refusal to engage with what they saw as an attempt to stir drama. For others, it was something more complicated, a deliberate choice to let the story breathe without interference, perhaps because it resonated in ways she wasn't prepared to admit publicly. Adding to the intrigue, a few commentators suggested that Melania's non-response might have been more calculated than it appeared. In their view, ignoring the story denied it the oxygen of direct confrontation, while quietly allowing Marla's words to hang in the air. Whether that was strategic silence or personal restraint, it only fueled speculation that there was more being communicated between these women than anyone was willing to say aloud. That's where the speculation about an unspoken alliance began. Could Melania have seen Marla's interview not as an attack, but as a reflection of truths she, too, understood? The two women have never been close in the public eye, but they share a rare perspective. Both have been married to the same man. Both have navigated the constant glare of the media, and both have had to balance personal dignity against the demands of public life. If there is an alliance, it exists in the shadows, unconfirmed and unspoken. But sometimes silence itself becomes the message. Melania has always been selective with her words, often letting her presence or absence speak for her. And when two people share the same history, sometimes they don't need to speak at all for the meaning to be understood. And Melania's silence after Marla's revelations was louder than any defense or dismissal could have been. And that silence leaves one burning question. Was this the start of a quiet alliance between two women who know the same man too well? If you watched the interview and felt the weight of every pause, you weren't alone. This wasn't just a celebrity moment. It was a rare glimpse into a history most people only speculate about. Whether you see it as courage, coincidence, or quiet strategy, one thing is certain: the story isn't over. So what do you think? Was Melania's silence an act of loyalty or something more? Leave your thoughts in the comments because your perspective might be the missing piece in this puzzle. And if you want more stories that pull back the curtain on power, relationships, and the moments caught between the headlines, make sure to like, subscribe, and watch the next video waiting for you here.